By the mid-1970s, the MiG-25 had achieved credible worldwide recognition. It had become a source of some concern to potential enemies of the Soviet Union. Foxbat was the code name NATO gave to the MiG-25 interceptor. Foreign intelligence agencies were desperate for anything they could get on this new Soviet aircraft. Any information was gratefully received. The Cold War was actually a hotbed of espionage activities and minor political and military incidents. One famous episode during East-West confrontation happened in 1976. The MiG-25 found itself the focus of worldwide attention. MiG-25 and MiG-31 interceptors, the best just got better. Part 2. On the 6th of September 1976, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Bilyenko hijacked the top-secret fighter to Japan. He flew the MiG-25 from the Russian Far East aerodrome at Chuguyevka to Hakodate Civil Airport in Japan. Along with the aircraft, the Japanese got access to the top-secret Soviet IFF codes, that's identification friend or foe, and other Soviet military secrets. At first we thought some sort of accident had happened to the MiG-25. It never occurred to us that it could have been hijacked. But we soon realized it was a case of treachery. To be honest, behavior like that from a Soviet citizen left a bad taste in the mouth. It was a nasty thing to do. It was very hard for me as a pilot to accept that one of my colleagues could do such an awful thing. I mean, he hijacked our Soviet interceptor, the best in the world at the time. The Air Force had just begun to get hold of these aeroplanes. People were excited about this interceptor that had been designed and developed and successfully tested and finally built. Our military pilots were just getting used to it. The guy was a jerk. He didn't care about his country. He was a man with no feelings for his people or for his motherland. The Soviet Union demanded that the aircraft and the pilot be returned, but the United States granted Viktor Bilyenko political asylum. Eventually, under pressure, the Japanese had to give the MiG-25 to the Soviet Union, but not before they and the Americans had examined it in minute detail. The aircraft was covered all over with technical information about it, all translated into Japanese words and characters. They also sampled each turbine and compressor blade from the engine. They took the canopy apart because they wanted to understand how the canopy plexiglass could withstand the great heat produced at high speed and high altitude. They drilled holes in primary aircraft parts to investigate the metal characteristics, and when we got the aircraft back, we found American-made circuit breakers installed in it. Apparently, they tried some tests on various bits of equipment, but they blew it. We still don't know why Viktor Bilyenko hijacked the aircraft. Was it a setup by American intelligence? Or was it just that Bilyenko wanted a better life abroad? Whatever the reason, it put the defense capacity of the Soviet Union under great stress. That was critical. In the Soviet Union, the hijacking did speed up the further development of the aircraft. Not only that, but the Mikoyan Design Bureau started work on the new MiG-31 interceptor. Simultaneously, MiG-25 modernization was proceeding apace. A new version was called MiG-25 PD, PD being the Russian abbreviation for Upgraded Interceptor. Everybody knew that the hijacked MiG-25 had been minutely examined by foreign experts. So the Soviet Union decided on changes to the armament system, the IFF friend or foe codes, and other things. And of course, the current aircraft systems had to be replaced with new ones. It wasn't easy, but what else could we do? First of all, they changed the aircraft detection system. The new MiG-25 airborne interception radar was installed. It could detect low-level airborne targets. That had become necessary with changing threats. It had previously been the case that bombers would fly as high as possible to avoid an enemy's air defense systems. As anti-aircraft missiles developed, that had to change. The bombers began to fly low. Now, attacking aircraft became very hard to track, either with ground or airborne radars. Earlier MiG-25s couldn't detect a target flying less than 500 meters above ground because of the ground reflection effect. The MiG-25 PD radar could detect a target flying at only 50 meters above the ground. The maximum target range also improved. The PD could hit a target flying as high as 30,000 meters. That was a 3,000-meter improvement on its predecessor's capability. The new detection system now included infrared sensors. An airborne target could now be detected without emitting radar signals. Detection range was shorter with infrared, but the pilot could avoid illuminating his target with radar and thus alerting it. The R-40 missiles were improved, and the R-60 short-range missiles were added to the aircraft armament system. Actually, this upgrade was like a whole new life for the aircraft. It was a big improvement. All the armament was changed, new radars were installed, and the overall aircraft performance increased significantly. About 150 MiG-25 PDs were built, and in fact, all the previous MiG-25 interceptors were also upgraded. They were called MiG-25 PDS, the S meaning upgraded in service. There was another upgrade version, and that was called MiG-25BM. It was a specially developed anti-radar version. About 40 of them were built. The total production of all the upgraded MiG-25s amounted to 1,200 aircraft in all. I would say the MiG-25 was essential for the Soviet Union, but also for world aviation. It was absolutely an achievement, with great aerodynamics and a superb power plant, very advanced for its time. The new approach had required so many problems to be solved by the designers and engineers. This aircraft really boosted advanced technologies in the Soviet aviation industry. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union was accelerating technologically, particularly in aviation. I think that was an achievement for the whole Soviet people. The MiG-25 was a world great in the history of aviation. It went into service at the peak of the Cold War, and it turned into a symbol of Soviet advanced technology. It set a world altitude record in 1977, and 36 years later, in the second decade of the 21st century, that record holds. Not only that, but the MiG-25 remains the fastest Russian aircraft ever built. You might ask, why didn't they build an even faster aeroplane after the MiG-25? Well, the race for aeronautical speed slowed down significantly when they got to 3 times the speed of sound. Although there are still a few research bureaux where they're looking at hypersonic speeds, it seems likely that the objective will be just too expensive for manned flight. So the plan changed to concentrating on improving aircraft equipment and armament rather than continuing the competition for speed. And that's where the story of the MiG-31 interceptor begins. During the Cold War, the air defense of the northern and far eastern regions of the Soviet Union was extremely difficult. The severe climate made ground-based radars virtually impracticable. It wasn't even particularly easy to establish the necessary wide network of airfields. Hence the requirement for a long-range interceptor. During the 1960s and 70s, the Tupolev 128 was the only long-range interceptor in the Soviet Union. It was a 1950s design. Neither its equipment nor its armament met the new requirements, to say nothing of its speed and altitude capabilities. The MiG outperformed the Tupolev in many respects, but it was not a long-range interceptor. This was when new attack tactics were coming in. Aircraft would fly at very low level to get through the air defenses. Another problem to solve. Cruise missiles were yet another threat. Their low-level terrain following was a new capability at the time. Tracking and destroying these comparatively small flying weapons was extremely hard. So the new interceptor needed very long range, but most of all, it had to be a product of new ideology. The MiG-31 concept derived from the MiG-25 interceptor and all of its operational experience. We needed better range and better altitude than the MiG-25 offered. We especially needed an aircraft that was faster at low level. Also, we were looking for new radar and new missiles. The missiles had to be extra long range. It was common knowledge that the MiG-25 could track only one target at a time, one by one, as we say. The new interceptor had to have multiple target tracking. But one aircraft standing against a whole horde of attacking aircraft or missiles would not be enough. The whole concept had to be changed. The new idea was to use interceptors in a group. Command and control and direction would be provided by special data transmission equipment. The designers started developing the MiG-31 in 1968. Gleb Lazino-Lazinskia was appointed chief designer. He was replaced after 8 years in 1976 by Konstantin Vasilchenko. The MiG-31 project was known in the factory as E155MP. That harked back to the MiG-25's factory code E155. In Russian, those letters MP stand for Multi-Role Interceptor. The general layout of the new MiG-31 was quite like its predecessor, MiG-25. The new aeroplane had 2 engines, 2 tail fins, a moderate sweep tapered wing, and side air intakes with a wedge shape. However, layout was the only thing the two had in common. The MiG-31 was, in fact, a different aeroplane. The MiG-31 became the first Soviet fighter to be powered by bypass turbojets. Among other things, the bypass was more fuel-efficient in dry thrust, that's to say without reheat in operation. And the new engine was smaller, which allowed extra space for fuel tanks. This new power plant was developed in the design bureau headed by Pavel Soloviev. It was the D30 F6 engine, and at maximum power in reheat, the combined thrust of 2 of them was 31 tons. The leading-edge root extensions on the front of the wing improve maneuverability at high angles of attack. There's also an advanced flap system that increases lift at lower speeds. The MiG-31 has an endurance on continuous patrol of 3.5 hours. That's almost double the MiG-25's. And in case you should think we're making demeaning comparisons with the MiG-25, well, it's not that at all. It is, in fact, a way to better understand the impressive development of the MiG-31. Overall, you could say these aircraft have similar maximums of speed and altitude. But the MiG-31 is much more combat capable. The MiG-31 has a 2-person crew, pilot and navigator weapons systems operator, or WISO. Second cockpit behind the pilot has a big screen for displaying the tactical situation. Originally, the designers expected that with the pilot in front, the seat behind him would be occupied by a group commander, and that group commander was to be a general. The thinking was that these groups of aircraft would be employed for very important strategic missions, and important missions had to be under the control of a general. But further mature consideration and research suggested that what the successful prosecution of the strategic mission really needed, instead of a general on board, was simply a good navigator weapons systems operator. During combat missions, each crew member has his own part to play. The aircraft commander flies the aircraft, launches missiles, fires the cannon, and makes final decisions in all sorts of different situations. The control column has a trimmer switch. It's there to reduce the load for the pilot when he's maneuvering. This one returns the aircraft to the horizon, and the radio communication button is next to it. This is the brake lever, both for the nose and the main wheels, and also the buttons to launch the missiles and fire the cannon. Conventionally, the throttles are on the left. 2 engines, hence 2 throttles. Their positions can be secure position, idle power, maximum power, minimum reheat, and full reheat. The navigator plots tracks, continually corrects them when required, and ensures the appropriate readiness for combat. The navigator, who's also the wizzo, can also fly the aircraft. So there's a pair of throttles in the second cockpit too. And here's how the extending control column pulls up when you need it. The weapons control system of the new fighter was called Zaslon, a barrier in Russian. The core of the system is the radar with a phased antenna array. This system was designed in the Tikhomirov Scientific Research Institute for Instrument Design. Earlier generations of radar had mechanical moving antennae. A phased antenna radar scans electronically without the head having to move. Electronic scanning provides a whole picture almost instantaneously. And not only that, but the phased array radar can provide coordinates for several targets at the same time. So the MiG-25 radar could only track 1 target. The MiG-31 radar can track 10 targets simultaneously. The associated computer helps identify which are the most dangerous. It can detect targets out to 200 kilometers. The Zaslon system was pivotal to the MiG-31's operation. It detected and tracked targets, and it authenticated the weapon's lock-on to targets. As crew commander and pilot, all I had to do was put the marker on the targets in the display, and then choose a maneuver, left, up, right, down, fly this way, that way, anything really. So basically, I just aligned the marks on the display and pushed the button. And that was that. The MiG-31 is the first interceptor capable of attacking several targets at once, including cruise missiles flying at low level. 4 missiles can be launched in one attack against 4 different targets. I was on a training sortie. I knew there were 4 airborne targets somewhere up ahead. Had to shoot at them. I'm just sitting there looking around, nothing much to do. I think to myself, well, there's that wizzo behind me. He's the guy who's supposed to find the targets. I'll just hang loose till then. So I say to him, how you doing, mate? How's the work going? He says, what work? I'm asleep. Asleep? You've got to be joking. So who's doing the work? He says, the Zaslon's doing it. It's in automatic. So I relax a bit. Soon the first target pops up on my display. I put the mark on it and launch a missile. A few seconds later, there's the second. Another missile. Bang! Both targets hit within seconds. Then the third and the fourth come up. In just 10 seconds, I've launched 4 missiles. 4 targets hit. The navigator says, okay, boss, mission complete. Targets destroyed. We're off home. The MiG-31 became the first fighter in the world with such a phased array radar. It remained ahead for quite a while because Western fighters didn't catch up till nearly 2 decades later. This fighter can also do its stuff in standalone mode, that's to say without help from ground radars. The encrypted data transmission system on the aircraft is said to be jam-proof. It allows several fighters to transmit the air situation to each other and to ground facilities as well. A group of 4 aircraft can scan an airborne area up to 900 kilometers wide. The Zaslon system in the lead aircraft interacts with the systems in the other aircraft. When a target is detected, it's the lead aircraft commander who makes the final decision. With multiple targets, he assigns targets to particular aircraft, including, of course, himself. In other words, the leading aircraft is responsible for target distribution. The MiG-31 can also be the leading aircraft for different fighter types, often, for instance, with a group of Su-27s. It also has an infrared search and track IRST system with a detection range of 40 kilometers. The MiG-31 first prototype was built in summer 1975 and flight testing began in the autumn. 16th of September 1975, the MiG-31 Interceptor made its maiden flight, carrying ID number 831. The test pilot for this momentous occasion was Alexander Fedotov. At the time of this maiden flight, Alexander Fedotov was already a distinguished test pilot of the USSR and a hero of the Soviet Union. He'd been working for the Mikoyan Design Bureau as chief pilot for 22 years. Fedotov had set a lot of the world records. He was the man who flew the maiden flight of the MiG-23, the MiG-25 and the MiG-29. For his work on the MiG-31, he was awarded the Lenin Prize. MiG-31 turned out to be Alexander Fedotov's last maiden flight. On the 4th of April 1984, Fedotov and test navigator weapon systems operator Valery Zaitsev were flying the Interceptor. It was a routine test flight to check the aircraft after scheduled maintenance. A few minutes after takeoff, a warning came on indicating they were running very low on fuel. Fedotov decided to abort the flight and turned back towards the aerodrome. Flying back inbound, he asked air traffic control to look behind the aircraft to see if there was any trail of leaking fuel. There was none. All the while, the situation was getting worse. The warning system was now indicating that the fuel level was critically low. Fedotov made the decision to land as soon as possible. He started his descent and turned hard onto the runway heading. The maneuver was perfectly appropriate for an empty MiG-31, but the aircraft wasn't empty. The system had been giving false warnings. The fuel tanks were almost full, and the aircraft was too heavy to sustain the turn. Fedotov tried to recover, but he was too low. They had no chance. Alexander Fedotov and Valery Zaitsev both died. The warning system played a dirty trick on them. Had it been a failure of the transducer so that all the lights lit up at the same time, Fedotov would have realized that there wasn't a leak and the tanks weren't empty. But the warnings came on progressively, one by one, just as if the tanks were actually emptying. His speed and height on approach were a bit higher than you'd want for a normal landing, so he decided to make a hard turn to significantly reduce his speed. He thought that the aircraft had lost at least 10 tons of fuel, but it hadn't. It was too heavy, and it flicked. Such was the fate of the men. One moment they were alive, they could still speak, they were still thinking. But nothing could be done to save them. Even if they'd ejected from the aircraft, they would not have been high enough. We were at the test airfield at Akhtubinsk when the terrible news came through. For hours, I just couldn't believe it. I thought it must be a mistake. I was waiting for them to tell me that everything was fine. I just couldn't believe it. Well, the next day we were ferrying 2 MiG-25s over there. As we turned on finals for the runway, I saw where Fedotov had crashed. It was only then that I finally realized he was really gone. You might say that the sky always takes the best men. With Fedotov, many people say that God took him away. God always takes the best. MiG-31 fighters went into operational service in May 1981. They were delivered to the Soviet Air Force in large numbers in the first half of the 80s. By the end of the decade, MiG-31s were based at more than 20 aerodromes across the vast territory of the Soviet Union. MiG-31 two-seat interceptor. Length 22.7 meters. Height 6.15 meters. Wingspan 13.46 meters. Maximum takeoff weight 46,200 kilograms. Maximum speed 3,000 kilometers per hour. Operating ceiling 20,600 meters. Range 3,000 kilometers. The MiG-31 is pretty big and heavy. With its takeoff weight of significantly more than 40 tons, it's more like a ship than a fighter. The MiG-31 replaced a number of older interceptor fighters with lesser combat capabilities. The crews had to get used to long-distance flights, which required them to be specially qualified. Also, these patrols were sometimes over the waters of the Arctic Ocean. That added extra stress for the crews. When you're flying the MiG-31, there's no time to relax. Constant vigilance is essential whenever you're on board, you know. It sometimes surprises pilots with plenty of experience in other types of aircraft when they fly the MiG-31 for the first time. I heard one of them say that when you take off in the MiG-31, you breathe in and you don't breathe out until you've landed. I came across it in 1992. I still remember my first flight. I'll never forget it. It engenders very strong emotions. Well, it's the aeroplane itself. It's a bit like a ship. Flying this aeroplane makes you very proud. It's a great feeling when you're in control of a fighter that weighs nearly 50 tons with all its armament. It's a splendid aeroplane. The MiG-31's weaponry includes 4 R-33 long-range missiles carried under the fuselage. The R-33 can hit high-speed targets up to 120 kilometers away. And those targets can be at heights of anything between 25 meters and 28,000 meters. The MiG-31 also carries up to 4 R-60 short-range missiles or 2 R-40 medium-range missiles on the underwing pylons. And there's also a 6-barrel GSH 623 cannon with 260 rounds of 23mm ammunition. Cannons mounted in the fairing behind the starboard main undercarriage bay. The NATO code name for the MiG-31 is Foxhound. Like any advanced military aircraft, Foxhound was kept secret from foreign intelligence investigations. But sometimes, even the best-kept secret eventually comes to light. In 1985, the KGB arrested a man who worked for one of the Soviet defense institutes called Adolf Tolkachov. It soon became clear that he had passed information on the MiG-29 and MiG-31 weapon systems to the West. So a decision was taken to modify the MiG-31, and in particular, its weapons systems. The new modifications included an upgraded radar and upgraded R-33 missiles. The new version of the fighter was called MiG-31B. It also sported a new in-flight refueling system that significantly increased its flight endurance and enlarged its interception zone. That was particularly important when the fighter was patrolling the northern borders of the country. On the 30th of July 1987, test pilot Roman Tuskayev and test navigator Wizzo Leonid Popov flew a fighter interceptor over the North Pole. It was a global first. The flight took 6.5 hours and they were refueled twice from air tankers. The MiG-25 had also been expected to get an air refueling system, but eventually the idea was turned down and they only ever got as far as flight tests. By the beginning of the 90s, about 500 MiG-31 interceptors had been produced in various versions, and a new aircraft, the MiG-31M, was about to go into production. The cockpits and the computerized flight systems had been upgraded. It carried more fuel. Various modifications had been incorporated that improved the aircraft performance. There were new engines offering greater fuel efficiency and more power. In fact, you could hardly call the aeroplane a MiG-31 because it was actually better in nearly all respects than the MiG-31. The Zaslon M weapons control system could track 24 targets and attack 6 of them simultaneously. There were 6 long-range missiles under the fuselage, up from 4. Target detection range and indeed the range of the missiles themselves were significantly better. But actually, those very long-range missile launches never happened. We didn't do them from our aircraft, and neither did our, shall we say, putative enemies launch them from theirs. As was often the case at that time in the 1990s, a prospective development program was halted. The aeroplane didn't satisfy all the official tests. The technological experience of developing the M version proved useful in the further development of existing MiG-31s. Of course, they weren't as capable overall as the full M version, but it was at least a step forward. The first upgraded aircraft, now called MiG-31BM, went into Air Force service in 2008. Keeping up with worldwide fashion, both cockpits now boasted multifunction displays. A satellite navigation system was fitted. Number of weapons hard points under the wing was increased from 2 to 4. The aeroplane's combat efficiency was boosted by almost 4 times for some operational capabilities. This is Savasleika Air Base. It's in the Nizhny Novgorod region where most of the MiG-31 interceptors are stationed. The maintenance squadron is here, where the aircraft get periodic checks and regular planned maintenance. It's here that all the various systems and bits of the aircraft can be checked. Engines can be replaced, snags can be fixed. One of the unusual features of the MiG-31 is the strange undercarriage design. The aircraft was heavy enough to need a 4-wheeled main undercarriage. This layout reduces the load on runway surfaces and actually makes it possible to operate the aircraft on ice airfields. The MiG-31 flight simulator is used for training and the continuing improvement of flight skills. For instance, it trains crews in reacting to in-flight emergencies. During this pre-flight briefing, the Air Force unit commander assigns crews to different missions and receives readiness reports. The crews are briefed on weather conditions and forecasts, diversion airfields, and many other details of the planned flights. They do a run-through of the flight before they even get to their airplanes. Technicians prepare the airplanes on special parking stands. They fuel the tanks with kerosene and charge the oxygen and nitrogen tanks. As a matter of interest, the compressed nitrogen is used for opening and closing the canopies. Before they climb in, the crews do a walk-round visual inspection. Once the engines are started, they check the aircraft systems with the technician in constant communication with the crew. Taxi to the runway. They usually take off in full reheat. These days, the MiG-31 is a most powerful interceptor aircraft, comparable in many respects to the American 5th-generation fighter, the F-22. Today, the Americans recognize that if there is one aircraft to compare with the F-22, it is the MiG-31. First of all, it's got a more powerful radar. And secondly, its missiles have a bigger payload and better range than the missiles on the F-22. The MiG-31 is faster than the F-22. Its dynamic field of interception is greater. The MiG-31 is in fact the most versatile interceptor with the best abilities in target interception. This is an extremely powerful weapons system. Also, MiG-31 interceptors work well in a group, sharing all their data with each other. A MiG-31 group provides the perfect area defense. I'd like this aircraft to keep soldiering on, to keep being updated. But a lot of people complain that it's very expensive. The fuel price is high, the price of the airplane itself is high. Today, everything's money. But you have to realize, if you want a good thing, you have to pay good money. Because this airplane fulfills the missions that other aircraft can't manage. Pay the proper attention to it, and then the MiG-31 will live long. The MiG-25 and the MiG-31 were landmark aeroplanes in world aviation. Each of them was at the forefront of scientific and technological progress in its time. They were revolutionary in so many ways. Without any doubt, it was a breakthrough. When the MiG-25 was created, it was an extraordinary breakthrough. We achieved those speeds, those heights. It was a really powerful breakthrough. And from that base, we created the amazing MiG-31. Speed and everything else were kept the same, but we definitely improved the combat capabilities. This is an aircraft of the highest performance. All of this MiG-25 and MiG-31 family of aeroplanes have very high potential. It's a good, long-term platform for fulfilling different tasks. All of these new features of the MiG-31 have such great potential that it is too early to predict where it'll all end. The potential is nowhere near exhausted yet. As of 2012, the MiG-25 RB reconnaissance bombers continue to serve the Russian Air Force. The MiG-25 interceptors have been superseded by the more advanced MiG-31, and the potential of that aeroplane is huge. There is no doubt that this interceptor will be successfully protecting Russian air borders for many years to come.